are doing okay. And this is the Cold War Part 2. In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about the Korean War, and we're going to talk about uh, supranational organizations, right? Particularly the United Nations. And we're going to talk about how the role of the United States in a post-war world is going to change and shift a little bit. Okay, and we're going to become a little bit more responsible for those other conflicts when in previous times we could have been a little bit more isolationist. Okay, and um, at times when we look at the U.S. in our background and our history, our individual presidents and our individual leaders have had massive impacts on how these things evolve and how these things happen. And that's particularly the case as it relates to um, the Korean War, but also to Vietnam and further additional conflicts after that. Okay? Now, as you recall, we talked a little bit about how Soviet Union wants to grow and wants to expand. Right? That's part of their doctrine, but ultimately that's what Stalin wants, is to make the Soviet Union stronger and more powerful and larger and cover more territory. Well, Korea is a really good example of that. Okay, now when you look on the map, you've got China kind of over here, and then just coming off of there, you've got the Korean Peninsula. Little bitty, small, tiny area, right? And in China, we talked previously about how they had a civil war going on, right? You had nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek, and they're fighting communists led by Mao Zedong. And as China's in a civil war, we're trying to figure out which side to pick and who to help and who to assist. Okay. Now we end up picking Chiang Kai-shek, but we don't really do a whole lot to help him. Okay. And if we have any failing as a nation, it's when we try to help other nations, we do a really poor job of it. Okay. Well, after World War II ends, 1945, you see the Soviet Union in what we call it, inhabiting part of the Korean Peninsula. Okay? Now they're there because they pushed some of the Japanese out of the Korean Peninsula, right, during the very end of World War II. But they also kind of control part of it, right? You know, anytime we control territory, it's a good thing. And so the Russians are in the northern part of the Korean Peninsula. Well, you got to remember the Truman Doctrine, and as such, we end up occupying the southern part of the peninsula, right? And I'm sure y'all all recall from World Geography, you got a peninsula that juts out into the ocean, right? Surrounded on three sides by water. And up in the north, you've got the Russians, and down south, you've got the Americans. Okay. Now, it is a little bit of an example of a proxy war. Okay. If you got questions about a proxy war, you can drop a comment below, and I can hook you up on that one. But essentially, we, the United States, are going to fight China, and we're also going to kind of shove a little bit of influence towards Russia via the South Koreans. Okay? We're going to give them money, we're going to give them weapons, we're going to give them training, we're going to prop them up to make sure that they can be like strong in the face of anyone coming out of the north and coming to challenge it. Okay? Now, because the whole country and the whole area has been in disarray for so long, there's a really high danger of a civil war between various different factions. Okay, mostly between communists and then anybody else opposed them, really. So what happens is you have this division between North and South, you know, communist Russia and China kind of propping up North Korea. as well as the U.S. propping up South Korea. 1950, everything's all good and well, right? And we're supposed to keep everything separated. And then the United Nations comes in and says, you know what? If we wait a few years and keep everything settled, then we can have an election, and Korea can unify and they can settle their own affairs with what they want to do. Okay, that seems like a good idea on paper, but it's a little bit difficult to actually pull off. You got Russian tanks up in the north, you got Americans down in the south. Okay, so the Korean War is kind of an example of the United Nations not really doing that good of a job when it comes to actually taking care of business. Okay? Now, Americans are trying to keep things peaceful. We're trying to keep things like not on fire and not at war. And we do a pretty decent job until, excuse me, until the Russians kind of convinced the North Koreans that they need to take the entire peninsula by force, right? And they kind of sell it to them, by the way. Say, look, these Americans are kind of weak, right? They're not going to do anything. If you have the guts to go down there, push down below the 30th parallel, you got this peninsula that's cut in half. It's cut in half at the 30th parallel, right? Y'all remember, lines of longitude and all that stuff, latitude, whatever. So it's, the nation is divided at the 30th parallel. So the Russians, they whisper in their ear and say, listen, if you take it by force, who's going to stop you? Right? So that's exactly what happens in 1950, right? So 1950, North Korea invades South Korea, which kicks off the Korean War, okay? And this goes on for 3 years, right? And it's kind of difficult because it kind of takes the United States by surprise. Now, kind of one of the interesting things about it is Truman, rather than treat it as a legitimate war of attrition, war against China, or war against the Soviet Union, or whatever, right? He says, no. We need to keep this thing limited, right? And in doing so, he's a little bit sneaky about it. Rather than go to the United States Congress in order to declare war, he decides he's going to go to the United Nations. They're going to build a coalition and then go fight against China, Russia, and the North Korea. Okay? And that's kind of a big distinction, right? Because up until that time, the American president got authorization from Congress in order to conduct a war. Okay? And with the Korean War, they did not do that, right? And it's a little bit slimy, right? Like it's not quite right, okay? And in removing Congress from the discussion, you now have a whole bunch of Americans that are overseas doing stuff that a lot of the American public doesn't necessarily grasp, doesn't necessarily know, and even if they did know, didn't necessarily approve of. Okay? That's a little bit tough, right? All right. So this goes on for 3 years. And as this is going on, this is where you have normal ground combat operations, right? And it's really, really, really tough. It's really bad. Yeah. Problem becomes, since they didn't go through Congress, you don't necessarily have that outrage because you don't really fully grasp that it's an actual hot war on a global stage. Okay? And I think the Americans were a little bit jaded by that, right? Like, oh, it's some kind of deal in Korea where a couple people are getting shot and they're anti-Russian and they're figuring it out, whatever. Like they couldn't be bothered to really truly grasp it and ask all these questions. Okay? So you end up with American troops in Korea doing the majority of the heavy lifting. Okay, when I say doing the majority of the heavy lifting, I mean they're doing the majority of the fighting. Okay. Well, what happens is North Koreans kind of have some issues and they're not performing too well. A little bit of that is because of doctrine, a little bit of it is because of equipment, etc. But the big deal is it's just kind of a stalemate. Okay, meaning one side, the Russians and the Chinese kind of grind to a halt, the Americans kind of grind into a halt, and no one's making very much progress. All the while at the same time, excuse me, they're trying to conduct peace talks. Okay, so the invasion happened in 1950, where North Korea drops down. As early as 1951, the Americans are trying to have peace talks with everyone, which drag out for two plus years, right? So you have the idea of how is this going to end up, right? How is this going to finish up? How is this going to wrap up? Well, it's a stalemate, right? And one of the problems that it is a stalemate is because the Russians, as of 1949, they've got nukes, right? The United States has nukes. And the very nature, the very policy between the two nations is one of mutually assured destruction. Okay? Um, it's a really simple concept, right? If Russia has got a nuke pointed at us, we've got nukes pointed at Russia, it would be absurd madness for us to nuke each other and not only wipe each other off the face of the earth, but also in turn destroy the entire ecosystem and the whole balance of the world via nuclear war. Okay? And that's a very real threat. That's a very real consideration, right? Because once the Soviet Union got that nuclear capability, what do you think they did with it? They built more and more and more and more. And we did the exact same thing, right? So we kind of got this weird arms race where we're trying to build as many nukes as we can, as fast as we can, so much so that, like, during the late 90s, they figured it out. They said that we had enough nuclear weapons between us and the Soviet Union to destroy the world, like, 54 times over. Something silly like that. Like, a gajillion times more nukes than what we needed. Right? And that's kind of a big deal. Right? So, we're in negotiations with China, we're in negotiations with Russia, we're in negotiations with North Korea, and we're trying to figure out a way to successfully bring this thing to a close. And that's kind of one of the main problems and one of the main aspects of Korea, right, the Korean War. We sort of stumble to the finish line, and we receive this half-baked, somewhat peace agreement. And in all honesty, nothing's really changed within the region. Okay? And if anything, it's kind of been reinforced, or it kind of reinforces the idea that we need nuclear weapons in some capacity, even in something as ludicrous as limited warfare within the Korean Peninsula. Okay, here's what I mean by that. If I take a whole bunch of ground guys, a whole bunch of infantry guys, and I fight them against the Koreans, it's not going to go out too well. But if I bring nukes into it, it's going to be worse, right? And that becomes the defining characteristic for the Korean War. Okay? Truman goes to the Chinese, says, "Look, I don't want to do it. Y'all, I mean, we've got nukes. And I would hate to have to use those weapons in order to end this." And that's enough to end it. Okay? So just please understand that when we look at the Korean War, it's a little bit of a failure because, one, we don't necessarily have